Greetings. My name is Kyle Soley. I'm here with Sebastian Watt. We're lawyers at Reed Smith. This is the second video in a three-part series on tax reform and how some of the operations of tax reform affect NOLs. Sebastian and I have been talking with clients, and you know what they're saying, Sebastian? They're saying tax reform ate my NOLs. Tax reform ate my NOLs. And that's what we're here to talk about, especially in New York, Florida, and New Jersey. So this second video is going to cover Florida. Our first video covered New York. Clients are saying, I had NOLs, then tax reform came along, and the NOLs are gone. And they're saying, what do I do? And I'm going to turn it over to Sebastian, who's going to give us a technical walkthrough of the problem in Florida and some advice about what our clients can do.
Thanks, Kyle. So the issue we're talking about today in Florida is GILTI income, reducing the current year net operating loss that would otherwise be generated if GILTI just didn't exist. And that problem is caused by the computation of the corporate income tax base in Florida. So the starting point for the corporate income tax base in Florida before apportionment is adjusted federal income. Adjusted federal income is federal taxable income plus or minus Florida adjustments, as Florida additions or subtractions. Now, the way that GILTI gets into the Florida base is that GILTI is just a component of federal taxable income. So because Florida conforms to federal taxable income is defined in the Internal Revenue Code, and GILTI income is an inclusion in federal taxable income, it's also included in the Florida base. Now, Florida provides for a GILTI deduction, so a taxpayer in Florida gets to exclude GILTI income from the tax base in computing their Florida adjustments.
So there's a solution. We can go home.
We can go home. We're done. Florida doesn't tax GILTI, and we're done. That's not entirely true. There's a problem, and that problem is caused by this rule right here. A Florida subtraction never creates an NOL or increases the amount of a federal NOL. So what does that mean? Unfortunately, Kyle, that means your GILTI deduction is limited. There's GILTI going in, but it's not always coming out all the time.
Okay.
So let's walk through an example to really flesh out how that happens. So we're going to walk through a couple examples. Now let's take a situation where we have a U.S. parent and they've made an investment in a domestic subsidiary and a foreign subsidiary. Now let's just assume, for the purposes of this example, that both the subsidiaries earn the exact same amount and types of income. The foreign subsidiary's income generates $10 of net GILTI income inclusion. So that's the scenario that we're starting with. Let's walk through how that plays out for the U.S. parent and their investment in a domestic subsidiary.
And we would be assuming here, when we say GILTI for the domestic subsidiary, that they would be earning the same kind of income that would be GILTI if they were a foreign subsidiary.
Exactly right. So let's say their this U.S. parent's federal taxable income before any GILTI inclusion is a $10 loss. Their GILTI inclusion is $0 because their investment is in a domestic subsidiary, so there is no GILTI inclusion.
But it would be 10 because that domestic subsidiary has that kind of income. They just don't have to pick it up.
That's exactly right. So our taxable income before any Florida adjustments is at $10 loss. So when we go to compute our Florida tax base, we start with a $10 loss. Our GILTI deduction is, again, still 0 because there's no GILTI inclusion as a result of a domestic subsidiary, even though if the subsidiary were foreign, it would have that $10 GILTI inclusion. So the adjusted federal income or net operating loss for this U.S. parent that invested in a domestic subsidiary is a $10 loss. Now let's change the example a little bit. The only change we're going to make is that subsidiary is foreign and not domestic. The U.S. person's taxable income before their GILTI inclusion, again, is a $10 loss. Here we have our $10 GILTI inclusion. That eliminates our net operating loss, our loss at the federal level. So our taxable income, or our starting point for computing our Florida tax base, is that $0. Here's the problem. You have $10 of GILTI going in, but you have 0 coming out. And that's a result of this rule at the top of the page. A Florida subtraction can't create or increase the amount of a federal NOL. We think that creates a problem. because solely as a result of our U.S. person investing in a foreign subsidiary as opposed to a domestic subsidiary, their NOL has been wiped out.
Ate my NOL.
Their NOL was eaten. And that causes a problem under the Supreme Court's Kraft case that says that states cannot treat foreign commerce worse than domestic commerce. But we have a solution. And that solution is simply not to apply this Florida rule that limits your GILTI deduction. Instead, you should remove all of the GILTI income. If GILTI income goes in, all that GILTI income should come out, because that's the only way to remedy the constitutional violation and ensure that both taxpayers get equal treatment. So there is a case we should mention.
The Colgate case, right? The Colgate case. In the Colgate case, when you look at the Colgate, you may think, wow, this is great, guys. I know about Kraft. I agree that foreigners are being treated worse than domestics. You go and you do some research and you find the Colgate case, and you say, boy, the Colgate case sounds like it's bad news, right? The Colgate case looks bad. The thing is, the Colgate case isn't as bad as it appears at the surface. In the Colgate case, the court said it involved a dividend received deduction and a similar phenomenon to the phenomenon that Sebastian just described. But here's what happened in Colgate. The taxpayer didn't put on any evidence. Taxpayer didn't put on any evidence. It approached the case as a facial challenge to the statute and didn't at all try to prove the distinction between how it was treated as an investor in a foreign sub versus how it would be treated in a domestic sub. And the department took advantage of that. The department actually argued 17 times in its brief that the case is all about the evidence, all about what's in the record, all about the as-applied challenge. And the court went along with that. So the court said, as applied to Colgate, there's not discrimination really because they hadn't proved it. But we think that with a more developed record, that a taxpayer in the GILTI situation that we've described could establish that discrimination, but just would have to lay out the record and do that. So with a good record, we don't think that Colgate is the problem that it may appear on the surface.
That's good news. All right, so a couple last points before we wrap up. So before tax reform, so basically in counter tax years before 2018, the foreign dividend subtraction only occurred at the Florida level. So this sort of scenario that we painted, this problem that we've described, and the problem that the Colgate case described was a result of the fact that you did not subtract foreign dividends at the federal level, you only subtracted them at the state level. The point here is just that issue no longer applies for tax years 2018 and forward, because now the federal government, in computing your federal taxable income, gives you a deduction for foreign dividends. So sort of the issue that the Colgate case directly addressed is not so much of an issue. It's just that this GILTI nuance is sort of the go-forward issue. Watching this, you might think that, I have transition tax. Does that also eliminate or reduce my NOLs? If we just sort of applied Florida statute, we would say yes, 965 creates the exact same issue. However, Florida took a taxpayer beneficial position and said that 965 for Florida tax purposes is just excluded entirely from the federal base. And because of that, you don't have this problem, this tax-based computation problem that would potentially limit your deduction for 965. So for 965 purposes, all of it's going in and all of it's going out before making any sort of constitutional argument. Finally, we'll just note that if you did make a consolidated group election, the state might argue that they do not, in fact, treat a taxpayer that invests in a foreign subsidiary worse than a taxpayer that invested in a domestic subsidiary, because all of the income from the domestic subsidiary is being included in the Florida tax base, thereby reducing your NOLs, but only a portion of the foreign subsidiary income, that is that portion that is GILTI.
So they may say it's better, you're better.
They may say you're better off. But to that, we do have a counterpoint. You would say simply that for that domestic subsidiary, you're including all of its income, but you're also including all of its factors.
The factor relief, yeah.
Factor relief. If you, for GILTI, you're just including the income, and Florida does not, by statute, automatically include those factors. So we would say that Florida, just because you file a consolidated group election that includes all of the income of your subsidiaries, does not treat domestic income, does not treat foreign income more favorably.
Okay. Okay, so still take a look at it if you're filing on a consolidated basis. So that brings us to the end. So I guess the takeaway is run your NOLs, run them with and without tax reform, with and without the GILTI, and see if your NOLs are reduced as a result of tax reform, and if they are, using the arguments that we've described, look to restore them. And we also encourage you to look to our video that we've already recorded on New York and our upcoming video on New Jersey that has substantially similar problems. Thank you for viewing. We'll see you next time.